Oh. Hey everyone, I'm Carly Lake. I'm an artist and illustrator, and we're here to do a live painting demo today, a watercolor painting demo, and talk a little bit about the book that I illustrated with Heyday Books, which I'm beyond excited about. So, I live in Southern California. I have been illustrating for magazines, and this is my first picture book that I've illustrated. Also done some storyboarding work, and I also teach art. So if you guys have any questions about that, or about being an artist, about the process, about the book, I'd love to talk with you about it, and we'll get started painting soon. I hope you're all doing well and are healthy, and your families are well. Thank you for joining me today. And let's look at the book. So this is the book. The story is by Cindi Alvitre. And I met her at Cal State Long Beach, where I went to school and did my degree in illustration. And Cindi is a professor in the Native American Studies program. And I met her through there taking her class. And she presented this idea to me back then, almost 5 years ago now. And this story is a creation story, a Tongva creation story retelling with Cindi's own input, and it's about how the sun got up into the sky. So we have Waa'aka, the bird who fell in love with the sun. And I'm not going to read the story, but I do want to show you some of the pictures that I illustrated of the birds, and the birds are the main characters in this story. I was really fortunate to be able to work on this because I love painting different kinds of, natural animals and plants, and those are really the focus of this story. So here we have owl, we have kingfisher, and we have raven, and then the heron. And in the story you find out how the heron came to be the black-crowned night heron. So I'm going to be painting a black-crowned night heron today, which is a type of bird that you can find. You can find them, they live all over the world except for, I think it's Australia and Antarctica. Oh, hey everyone, I can see you on the chat. Thank you so much for the compliments. This is a little bit into the process before I get into painting. A lot of the pictures in this book are sort of composited from watercolor paintings I did. So you can see we have the 4 birds in this painting, and then we have a net in the background, the hands, and I actually painted those birds separately and then scanned them in and created the hands separately, the sun separately, and then some of these things are actually painted with watercolor brushes in Photoshop. So it's all put together in Photoshop at the end. And that way I'm able to mess around and tweak the colors, or, sometimes you're painting with watercolor, you make a little mistake, I can then edit that in Photoshop. So it's excellent. And so hopefully it's hard to tell, how things were really put together in the book. I wanted them to feel really integrated, but that is how most of the paintings went for this. So things were painted separately and then pieced back together to get it just right. So, oh, that's so cool, you guys. I'm so excited. Everyone's looking forward to the book. It's going to be out in June for pre-order at Heyday Books. And please feel free to ask me any questions in the chat. I can see it while I'm painting, so we can interact and connect. And it's exciting to see some people that I have not met before. So give me a shout out. So here's a sketch. It might be a little hard to see because I usually draw very lightly. And I'll do a drawing on tracing paper, like this one from the book, and then transfer it onto watercolor paper or some kind of illustration board to paint on. So that's what I did here, but this is a different sketch of black-crowned night heron. So someone's asking if when you read the book manuscript, did you have a vision immediately about what you wanted to do? Well, yes and no. So immediately images start firing in my head when I read the manuscript, and I was so excited just because of the world that Cindi builds. You know, you're starting from the very beginning of the universe. So you're starting from this very dark place, and then it's all coming to life and branching out in different ways. So yes, I had a lot of initial ideas, and they were really rich, but then you really have to get down into, okay, how is this actually going to be paced out with the words, and how should each page be reflected against the next page, you know, with the different compositions. So there was definitely some, immediate excitement for getting to paint a lot of different kinds of suns and a lot of different kinds of birds. And then once I start actually looking at what these birds are, because a lot of them are native birds to California, then I got even more excited to paint them. Okay, so first I want to do some washes. Whenever you're painting with watercolor, you're painting from light to dark most of the time. And the black-crowned night heron, they're kind of a funky heron because they're not really super long and elegant, but kind of hunched over. And they have this beautiful dark blackish blue streak on their back. So I'm going to start with some, like a blue wash over the whole thing. And I use these little cups, little trays to paint in, also extra bigger ones when I'm doing bigger swatches of color. We're painting pretty small today. So I'll add a little bit of water at first, and then I have a brush that I just used for mixing colors and doesn't really get used for actually painting. And it's a little flat brush. So those of you that are interested in painting with watercolor, the first step is to get the right paper that's not going to absorb the paint too fast, and you'll be able to work with it a little bit. Once you have some watercolor paper or illustration board, then you're pretty good to go. I usually use Arches watercolor paper or illustration board that's cold press, 300, and then always have some little scratch paper to test my color on before I paint. So this is looking a little slightly too dark. I'm going to add some more water. Okay. Alright. And I just use old like tomato sauce jars or peanut butter jars for my cups of water to rinse out brushes in, and I usually have 2 so that I can really rinse them out and reuse them for a different color. And what I love about these birds is that they have this amazing red eye, so we'll get into that later. Now, in actually drawing things for this book, a lot of it is pretty stylized, but still has a pretty good resemblance to the animals. I can't really help when I draw. I can't really get away too much from what things are, what, you know, proportions are really looking like. And we did want these animals to be familiar. Me and Cindi talked a lot about how we wanted different things represented. So there's like different symbolism in the book that we had to discuss. For one thing, the creator, Waa'aka, in the book was a tricky thing for us to figure out how we actually wanted Waa'aka to be represented. And I go off of what Cindi had envisioned and gave some suggestions that maybe we don't want it to be a man or woman, you know, Waa'aka is all encompassing or more encompassing than just that, and is not necessarily a human. So we ended up symbolizing Waa'aka as a hand, and with the sacred color, the red color. Okay. So that was one of the main symbols in the book, and then the birds are pretty close to resembling what they actually look like. Okay, so let's do some of this blue on the beak too, because the beak's going to be darker, and also around the eye. Watercolor is a very slow process, and you want to let things dry in between your layers if you don't want them to blend at all. So I'm just doing these base washes of color. Okay. So that looks like most of the blue we need. Alright. Yeah, so the initial sketch of this is in pencil. And like I said, I draw it on tracing paper beforehand and really get it right. And I don't really like the pencil to show too much through my paintings. I'm gonna build up more of the form with the color, so I do have some darker points, but overall it's pretty light. Okay, so now we're gonna get into some of the lower parts of this painting. This bird, they have a white body overall, but whenever I'm painting, I try to see more color into especially white and black. Try to bring out some of the other colors that are within that so that it's more interesting and it's more vibrant. Oh, and someone's asking about the quality of the brush. I am not the best person to ask about that. I was told to get some, I think it's this brush I have, the Samble. It's Sablette. I think that's what my watercolor teacher was recommending in school. But other than that, I just kind of go with more of the shape that I want. I specifically love this brush because it gets to a very fine point, but I can also press it down and make some wider areas. I use this one so much, and as you can maybe see, it's taped up because I refuse to let it be broken and go out of my life. So that's like my main brush, and then I have this bigger brush for bigger washes, and I have a few smaller ones. Some of them are Cotman, that's the brand, but I just don't really pay too much attention to that. I'm looking more at the price and the shape of the brush. So I also don't stretch. I don't really get around to stretching watercolor paper before I paint, so that's why I like to use board, illustration board, so then I don't have to worry much about any warping that's going on when I'm using a lot of paint, a lot of water. So if you're interested in learning about stretching watercolor paper, don't come to me. But if you are interested in avoiding that, then look into using some board. Okay, so I'm just gonna mix up some warmer tones for the body of the undercarriage of the bird and their legs. And I'm using mostly watercolor, but I do have some gouache that I throw in, and gouache is a little bit of a thicker medium, but it works the same as watercolor, and you can thin it down to pretty transparent layers. And this is really handy, this little squirt bottle, for just squirting in a few drops at a time. Okay. And colors are always going to look different in your palette than when you actually paint them. And then they're even going to look more different when they are dry. And I find that most of the time spent with a painting, oh, this has a lid on it, is mixing colors and getting them just right. So that's what I spend most of my time on when I'm painting, and then I just have a good plan of how I'm gonna actually get it on there beforehand, because there's not a lot of going back. Alright, so that's a nice bright yellow, but I still want a tad bit lighter. Okay. Okay, so they have some funky legs here. Now, right now I'm just laying down a base color. That's the underneath color, and then I can build up from there with the darker shades. So I'm just filling in the whole section of these feet, and then I'll get into the details and little nuances of the form and the shading. Oh, I was fortunate enough to see some of these birds. I've seen one when I was hiking, and I saw a few more at the Living Desert in Palm Desert, and they're just very mysterious to be around. But they have this amazing squawk, and that was one of the things that inspired Cindi to write the story, was the mystery to these birds, and also sort of their ugliness. Like, they're not necessarily the most elegant bird, and so that got her imagination sparked when she saw some of them on Catalina Island, and then learned that they only come out at night. I've seen them in the daytime, but they mostly hunt at night and are nocturnal birds because they can't really compete with the other herons. So that has a little bit to do with the story and how the heron turned into the black crowned night heron. Okay, so someone's asking how I first learned to paint with watercolors, and I had dabbled with them a little bit in high school in my art class, but didn't really understand how to use them until I got into Cal State Long Beach and into the illustration program there. And then I had an amazing watercolor teacher, so they actually have watercolor classes you can take within their illustration program, which I think is awesome. I got to take a class with Nina Chawla, who's one of the watercolor teachers and teaches illustration, and she's amazing. Like, if you ever can look up her work and her watercolor paintings, she can control the paint like nobody's business. And so we did a lot of outdoor painting in that class, which forced us to really push the colors and the light. And you know, I owe a lot to just using watercolor as my main medium to her, and the way that she was able to push us in that class to to understand like the techniques behind it. But she really pushed us to just practice a lot. She said that, you know, there's only so much that you can do. There's only so much that she could have taught us with the techniques, and then we kind of have to go on our own and figure out how we move the watercolor with our own hands. And so there's a learning curve that happens, and then all of a sudden it kind of clicks when you figure out like your own way to use it. Once you understand that, oh, okay, you know, I see that I'm pushing around the pigment, and I can add more pigment in certain areas when it's still wet. I can control that to some extent with how much pigment I add. Oops. So yeah, I owe it to Nina. Okay. So this bird has more of a grayish undercarriage, but I wanted it to have a little more color. So, all right, and so someone's asking if the name Waa'aka has anything to do with their squawk. I think so. I'm not really sure, but I've had a lot of people that I've introduced the book to so far kind of make that noise as they read it. They kind of read her name with a squawking. So sure, why not? We'll have to ask Cindi about that one. Okay. So I'm not going to leave this white, but it is lighter than this, so we're just going to get a little bit of a lighter tone. So if you are to make a mistake with blending in watercolor, the only way you can go is really getting darker to cover that area. Or like I don't do a lot of wet into wet washes where I'm using two colors and kind of blending them while they're still wet, but I can maybe show a little bit of that. But yeah, you can just add maybe a darker tone in some area where you made a mistake. You might have to tweak your design a little bit. And in some cases, I've made mistakes where I had to start over. But, you know, we try to avoid that one. So I would just say go with it. You have to kind of, you know, go with the flow with the watercolor. It's not that forgiving, so you want to maybe do some color studies beforehand. And then also don't be too hard on yourself if you do mess up. Try to figure out how that can be an attribute to the painting. I don't really do color studies. I was forced to more in school, but I get a pretty good idea of what I want to do in my head, and then after I sketch it, I'll start laying down those first colors. And I like the process of it being unexpected, that, oh, now I'm using this color, or this wash came out a little more pink than I even thought it was going to, but I'm cool with that. I think sometimes it lends to even more exciting color choices if you don't plan too much. And if something's still wet and there's a mistake, you can start to lift that pigment away. So that's another thing that you'll notice when you start practicing with it. Okay, so bird is pretty covered. I have some little details on the bottom. And let's see, we're about a half an hour in, so we're good. Okay. I
gonna do a sort of like a reddish brown for this stick here. Oh, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for the compliments. We're really excited about this book and sharing it even more and more with everyone. It took about 3 years in the making and trying to find a publisher, and I think we're so lucky that we, through a friend of a friend, knew that Heyday was around and that they had a native publishing program and that they might be interested in this native story. And they were. So we just kept working on it without even having a publisher. And I think we're also fortunate that, most of the book was illustrated by the time we found Heyday. I know that's not a usual thing that happens. Usually you have to start from almost square one with a publisher. So we're just really happy to be with them. And they have a lot of other awesome books to check out. Okay. This is also a little bit dark. It's still kind of wet though, so we can keep moving it around and lighten it up. And that nail is there for the bird, but I'm just gonna paint over it. Yeah, so if you guys have any other questions, feel free to ask. And if you're interested in seeing more of my watercolor work or some of the other kinds of art that I do, have a website that will get in the description of this. Ooh, see, there's a little mistake. That's okay. So that's another thing. Don't put your hand on the wet paint. But yeah, you can go to my website at carlylake.com and see some of my other watercolor paintings. Oh, will I ever write my own children's book? Well, I'm trying to work on a graphic novel that would be watercolor, and I would love to do my own children's book one day. I think this graphic novel is going to be a little more of like adult content, but yeah, I would love to write more. And, hopefully me and Cindi will collaborate again. So I'm going back into this little stump on the bottom here and just adding, while it's still a little wet, I'm just dropping in a little bit more pigment into places that I want to be a little bit darker. But you have to be careful that you're not going to scrub the pigment at all. If it's already dry and you start pushing into it, you could get this scrubby effect. Yeah, the graphic novel I would like to do, I want it to kind of have a feel of a children's book in a way that I would attract children to it with the imagery, but also have some more contemplative tones to the dialogue. Okay. I don't do lettering. I mean, I've done a little bit, and
It's not something that I dislike, but I can't say that I'm really practiced in it and really think about lettering a lot. It's something I actually have trouble with picking whenever I have to have done that, is picking fonts and things like that. So I'd rather leave that to someone else. Okay. Got a lot of pink into this here. Something that is a trick when you're doing a big wash of color is to tilt your paper, because you want the weight of the paint to keep going in that direction, and you don't want it to dry, and you don't want it to dry unevenly. So, I mean, I'm just painting this little twig, but just to give you an idea, if you're doing like some big wash, you can tilt it as you're moving down the page with that pigment. That's a little trick I learned when I was learning about watercolor. Something I never thought of. And something, another thing I hadn't thought of before that might seem obvious, but before I had taken the watercolor class, I didn't think about letting things really dry before painting on top of them again with another color. So that's why I'm moving around this painting. I'm letting this fully dry before I go over it with any other colors or shading, because I don't want them to pick up the paint. I want it to be a layer on top. So that's another trick. You can use a blow dryer sometimes to dry things quicker. Okay. So I did draw from a photograph for this and tried to tweak things a little bit here and there to kind of make it my own, and add in a little bit more clarity to the feathers so that it will have a stronger design. I also added in this as I was drawing. So, you know, if you're an artist, want to start painting or developing your own ideas, it's okay to start referencing photographs if you want to paint certain things, but I would recommend trying to tweak it, trying to, you know, explore exaggerating things here and there, especially with animals. And you're not, you know, if you're not doing like a scientific illustration, then you can really play with the colors and the attributes of the animal. And if you're looking at a photograph and something is, you know, this swish isn't the way you want it, then change that. Okay, so do these little leaves and then we'll get into some of that painting. I want these leaves to be really bright. I'm just gonna add into this yellow I already have a little bit of blue. Another thing that I see that sometimes people struggle with when they're using watercolor is that they won't use enough pigment, and they'll be a little bit timid with how much to put, and they might have these really faint colors that they're painting with. That's fine if that's what you're going for, and you know you want that lighter look. But if you do want richer colors, you don't have to switch to gouache or to acrylic. You can just really put in more pigment into that puddle. Okay. I have this great color, cadmium lemon. It's so bright. So like in some of the images in the book with these really bright yellows, I definitely used cadmium lemon and mixed it with other colors, and it'll maintain that brightness to those other colors. It's one of my favorite colors of watercolor. Okay. Alright, so we got this like olivey green, but let's push it a little more green. I hope mixing paint isn't as boring as watching it dry, because we're doing both today. Okay, I feel like this palette I'm using is absorbing a lot, so I'm going to use a different color, or a different paper, to see what color I'm going to get. Oh yeah, I like that. Oh, someone says cadmium is one of their faves. Yes, which cadmium? Like cadmium yellow? Is that what you're referring to? I got that one. That one's so nice and warm. I used that for painting the poppies in the story. Okay. So maybe I can show you a little bit of wet into wet, where I have this wet zone here with this lighter green, and then I have already mixed another green, and I'm gonna add that next to it, and they're gonna kind of blend in the center. So that's wet into wet technique. I mean, I didn't initially put water on the paper. That's something people do too, but for small areas like this, it's not really necessary. Well, I don't find it's necessary. Then you get this nice little subtle blend. You guys can see that. Oh yeah, cadmium yellow. There you go. Oh, I'm glad someone is interested in the mixing of the paint. And I hope it helps in any of your processes. Or even just to see, you know, how much time goes into just a small painting like this is important for us to see when we're looking at other artists' work, and understanding how many hours of practice go into being able to work with any medium. Okay, so there, I did a little bit of darker on the edges there. Ooh, do I have a least favorite or favorite subject to paint? Well, we can talk about both. So I would say my favorite is plants. Well, animals are a really close second, and then like any other weird thing that I might draw that's not in that category but is inspired by plants or animals, that's my favorite. And least favorite to paint or draw is a lot of like architectural things. But I can find a lot of interest in things that have a lot of like bulbous forms and organic shapes, and coupled with a little bit of more geometric. So yeah, I don't know. I would say least favorite is probably like cars or something. But in my most recent painting, I painted a car, and it was actually pretty fun. But I made it pretty strange, so I think it has to be tweaked in that way. Like, I do not want to paint a realistic looking car. Okay. So, now if I was going to add a background on this, I might have done a light wash in the beginning, but for time's sake, I just cut that out. But also, you know, I would maybe start painting around this at this point if I was doing a background. So laying in a lot of the lighter tones and then maybe painting some of the lighter tones in the background. And then I have a complete picture of where all of my colors are and how things are starting out, and then I can start adding in those darker tones. But we're not doing a background today. Okay, so let's get into some of the shading. I'm gonna get rid of some of this. I always have a towel. You can't really see it, but this is my towel to wipe off my brushes in between rinsing, or I just get rid of some of the colors in my palette. Okay, someone asked me, how much time would you say it took you to illustrate Waa'aka? Well, it was off and on illustrating the book for about 3 years, and it could have maybe been compressed into like 1 year. And then I'm also doing other things while I was illustrating it. So I was teaching. I do teach today as well, part-time, and I teach kids, and then also doing different freelance projects here and there, and working on my own personal fine artwork. So it's good though, because you're kind of bouncing around to different ideas and then coming back to this over and over again. It grew as I was working on it, and my skills grew as I started it when I graduated college, and then I'm coming out of there and evolving. I tried a lot of different mediums right out of college, like ceramics, and got into fiber art. So like those things started informing my drawings and my paintings in a nice way, and so I was able to like work on different parts of the story in different places and times in my life, and that gave me and Cindi a lot of time to reflect on the paintings as they were progressing. And we had several meetings where, okay, I've done this set of pages, and she gave me feedback on that. So it's been quite a long process, and kind of amazing that it's now going to be out in the world. So thank you for the questions. I've been practicing watercolor painting for like 6 years now. Okay, another color I like is Prussian blue. It's this darker turquoisey color, but not too much on the green end of the turquoise spectrum. And I like to kind of dull blues down with brown instead of using black. Yeah, adds a little more complexity to the color. So I don't want this blue that I'm going to use for some of the shading on the bird to be too vibrant and too saturated. So I just add a little bit of brown, but the brown goes a long way, so you can just mix in a little bit at a time. And sometimes I'll mix a color. I know it's gonna be kind of a darker shade, so I'll just like drop some of it in the next cup and add some water, so that I have 2 different variations of that value. I was really lucky in school too that at Cal State Long Beach they have a book class that you take as an illustration student, and I had a really awesome professor for that, who focused a lot on like creating the book as a complete concept in itself, and thinking about how the pages are, the page designs are reflecting the concept overall. And a big part of the concept in this book is that it's going from a darker point, the beginning, the start of the universe, where there's no life and nothing exists yet, to coming alive, the earth coming alive, plants and animals, lots of colors. So I tried to emulate that like that ebb and flow in the book, and then there's also a point where there's a drought, so I wanted the pages to overall have that color tone of drought, but also a little bit of chaos too, because emotionally the characters are in chaos at that point and they're really worried. So, you know, when you're thinking about illustrating the book, you can think about it in a conceptual way, like how does the brush strokes, the colors, the pacing of the book from one page to the next inform the overall concept and mood that you want to get across. And I think this story, even though it's the main character sort of defeated at the end, that there's also a lot of like triumph to it, and a sense that there's like new understanding to the community in the story. So I hope that there's that sense in the book as well of joy and triumph. Okay, so yeah, I'm just adding in some darker tones now, but not the darkest yet, just getting a little bit more detail. And so now my points that are lighter are kind of the like the brightest glare on the beak. And let's see. And I might leave some lighter points in the feathers too as I'm going along. And I know we have about 10 minutes left. We're gonna wrap up at 1, but we'll see. I might go a little bit longer than that to get to a finish point. Okay. So if you're interested in the book and purchasing it, it is available. It will be available for pre-order in June at heydaybooks.com. So you can find it there. And then it will be officially out on other platforms and on heydaybooks.com in September. Now, I love to use lighter shades of blue for some shading, so I'm going to add in some of that down here. And it's also in the chat when the pre-order is starting. Another thing that my teacher instilled in me, my watercolor master teacher, is to fill up your brush with the pigment. Don't try to paint if there's not enough pigment in the brush, so you can really get it in the puddle and have it locked on that brush if you're going to be filling in a big area especially. You don't want to have to keep moving back and forth. Alright, let's paint this red eye before we have to do any more shading. We don't want to miss that. Okay. I'm glad your nephew will have it. I hope they love it. Some of the themes in the story or the main theme is about being considerate of other people where you live, being considerate of the land that you live on, and taking those things into account, not not being too selfish with your actions, because it's really for the betterment of yourself and everyone else. So that's a great lesson that Cindi has brought to us through this story. All right, could you get me cadmium red? I don't have my cadmium red in the brown box. So these birds have these awesome red eyes. Okay. It's okay, actually. So I'll go over that with some darker colors. So if you're sticking with me, I'm gonna keep working on the shading. I want to get in a little bit of variations in the bird's wings. So I think we'll use some burnt sienna for some brown tones. Thank you. I think the way that I use watercolor too is pretty what's the word? Graphic? Pretty graphic in that I like to do solid swatches of shapes, and there's not too much blending going on. Just adding in some texture to the bird's wing here before I get into some of the darker colors. And thanks again for joining me, everyone. It's been really fun for me to paint this for you and talk about the book. If you have any other questions, feel free to ask. Someone said the eye's glowing. I actually made it kind of a hot pink eye instead of red because I didn't have my red on hand. But that's good. I think it looks cool. Oh yeah, so it's Prussian blue on the head, and it can get really dark. I'm gonna get darker with it in a minute, but it's a beautiful color. And I hope to do some more of these too and share more artistic processes that people can try on their own. So I'm gonna get some more shading under the belly. And maybe mix some of this hot pink I have for the feet. What I love most about using watercolor is the layering of colors. I like the unexpected layers of, colors that I get from different layer combinations, and also the ones that I know time and time again that I use when I paint. If you're someone who's interested in drawing or painting in general, and want to create more of a creative practice in your life around drawing, I would say to keep a sketchbook and try to draw every day, because it's going to improve your drawing capabilities exponentially as you practice, and also you're gonna find like your own voice with drawing or with using watercolor. Everyone uses a medium a little bit differently. So I can share some insight into the techniques, but when you actually sit down and do it yourself, you're gonna find your own groove to it. Oh, someone's asking if I ever paint cats. Actually, that's what I might be painting in my graphic novel I'm thinking about. This is a print, I guess. Oh, yeah. This is a drawing I made of my cat, and it's a digital drawing I did on my iPad, but could easily be a painting as well. And that was from a photo of him that got a little psychedelic. So yeah, cats are a big subject for me these days because I live with my cat. He's my baby. Okay, let's see. Let's just get into some of those darker tones so we can wrap up a little bit. And I'm thinking I'll have this painting available if anyone's interested in it. Have it available for purchase on my website after this. That's carlylake.com, so pretty easy to remember. Okay. Now, the biggest attribute other than the red eye of Waa'aka is the black streak on her back. So even though I'm going to be covering some of this shading that I already did, it's going to add some nice variation and a little bit of form into the shape. It's so satisfying when you get to add in these darker layers. For me, I really enjoy it. Okay, around her eye too has some nice darker points. Okay. Okay. Yeah, we're all hoping for the kitty graphic novel. Just have to write it first. Okay. And I'm looking at a photo right now as I'm painting, since this is kind of realistic painting that I'm doing. Okay, so now the beak has a little bit of more dimension to it. And we'll get that eye. Alright, and sometimes when you're painting with watercolor, you just have to let it sit and see what it's gonna do. Let it dry, then make the next step. Do little bits at a time. That'll prevent you from pushing too dark in one area where you might not have wanted to. Okay. Let's see. This part I want it to be a little more saturated than the top of the head, so I'm gonna add a little bit of ultramarine blue. Okay. Let me know if you guys have seen these birds anywhere. They hang out at the wetlands, near creeks sometimes. Like I said, Cindi saw them in Catalina Island, which is actually the setting of the story. It's never explicitly said in the story, but Pimu, which is the Tongva name for Catalina Island, is where the story is intended to be set. And so you always have the ocean peeking in the background of the pictures. Okay. So this is slightly different than any of the other night herons I've painted, which is good. Oh, so what town are they the official bird of? Is that Berkeley? And if you don't know, Heyday Books is out of Berkeley. They're an independent publisher there, and I think a lot of their books are in the bookstores out there. I'm in Southern California, as I said, but luckily I got to meet some of the people from Heyday before the pandemic hit. Oh, Oakland. Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know towns have birds. I don't know what my town bird is. Better find out. Okay. Ooh. Ah, you can see them. Yeah, they're probably hanging out in the branches. That's where I saw one. It was like almost didn't see it. So it was tucked under some branches. And like I said, they're nocturnal, so they're gonna be hunting at night and hiding in the daytime. But you can always go to the living desert and see one. I stood right next to it. Alright, I think this, ooh, okay, we're gonna go with it. I didn't know it was gonna be a little brown. I'm just adding water on my brush because it was a little bit darker than I wanted. So now I'm just gonna like push that pigment around so then it lightens all that up. And that way it won't dry dark. So while it was still wet, I just added more water, pushed it around. Okay, let's see. What else does this need? I think the bird feels pretty good. That's the trick, is to know when to stop. Add a little more shading under here. Under the wing of the bird. Maybe a little darker here. They're not this pink, but I'm happy with it. I like the more vibrant color on their chest. Okay. Feeling pretty good about this bird. I don't think I've actually heard their squawk before. Oh, the living desert. Yeah, it's great. Good. Nice gardens. Okay. There's the claws. I want to add a little more shading on the legs here. Just like a little bit of a darker around the edges of some parts. The shading on the trunk too. So the legs are gonna cast, or the feet are gonna cast a little shadow on the trunk. And I'm liking this blue shadow on this kind of pinkish brown trunk here, this stump. Anything where there's a little more color in the shadows than what you would usually think, oh, a shadow is gray or brown. I tend to go with blue shadows, but you could have green, you could have whatever you want. Ooh, so a little bit of blue pigment was in there, so I'm just gonna rub that around while it's still wet so it doesn't just get a solid drop of blue. Okay. Alright, and I want to do some shading on this twig too. Oh yeah, I definitely freestyle draw, freestyle paint. With the book, a lot of planning goes into the pages and sketching it out, and any other kind of painting you might see on my website. I've usually done a really full-on sketch of it and then transfer that drawing before I paint it. But you know, I like to just start working and see where it goes, and then especially in my sketchbook, but I will do that for some final pieces too. You've got a lot of the more unique ideas out of that, and then you can, you know, take those and work on them a little more and bring them up to the level that you really want. But I encourage that. I don't think you should always plan. I don't think you should always plan your colors. I don't think you should always plan what you're gonna draw. Definitely have, you know, if you're wanting to pursue that creative practice, give yourself some time to play. because that's really what it is in a lot of ways. You know, you're kind of like the master in this zone. You get to make whatever you want there. And so if you can master like how to draw certain forms and paint those, then you can start branching out and, you know, visualize wild things in your imagination and be able to put them on paper for other people to see. So I think it's powerful to be able to draw things observationally, how they are, because then you learn about how to draw form, and not only learn it, but your hand memorizes it, and then your mind hand connection memorizes, and you can branch out from there and start changing things. I hope that makes sense. Well, thanks for sticking with me, those of you that are still watching. This is pretty fun, but it is a slow process. And now I'm mixing some darker blue. I want this to have a little bit more contrast of the shading on the branch, and then we'll almost be done. Oh. How do I know when I'm done with a painting? I would say when I feel like there's a good enough contrast to the form. Like I like a lot of contrast between the lights and the darks, so I might want to keep pushing that until I get a good sense of the forms. And then also the unity of it, especially when you're working with color. Do I feel like I have a good balance of color around the page? I'll kind of look into that. And something I do more intuitively now. I don't really consciously sit back and say, okay, do I have pink here and here and here, or some kind of green here and here? But those are some of the things that I think I look out for. And then once I get in those darker tones, I'm like, okay, we're good to go, we're done. And then sometimes I'll just get tired and I'll step away from something for a while, maybe even a week or two, and then come back to it. And I'll think it was maybe done and then realize that there's some more that I could push. I could push more colors, push things brighter or darker, add something new in completely. Okay. So I feel like this is a nice part to end on. I feel like it's pretty finished, and now that we're ending on that note, I feel like this is good. It's got some good contrast, got some good balance and color. So thanks again so much for joining me and asking me questions, and again, we'd love to have this book in your hands. It's a wonderful story. Look up Cindi Alvitre. She's an awesome person, does many, many other things, is a professor, a writer, an artist in her own right. So we are really happy to share this with you. And thank you so much.